So, what we're going to look at now is the difference between positive freedoms and negative freedoms within liberalism. So, with positive freedoms, first of all, positive freedoms are supported more by modern liberals. So, this is the idea that the state can play a positive role in society and a positive role in people's lives. So, it can help individuals achieve their potential, their aspirations, and make dreams come true. And it's done through state-funded education, which provides us each with an opportunity. So it's about creating an equality of opportunity. So modern liberals really support an enabling state. They don't necessarily see the state or view the state in the same way that classical liberals do, or some classical liberals do, as a necessary evil. So those are the positive freedoms. So negative freedoms argue the opposite. So this is something which is supported more by classical liberals and neoliberals as well. So negative freedoms argue that the state should restrain itself from interfering in people's lives as much as possible. There should be something like Locke described as a night watchman state, but this should only really mop up those who are absolutely desperate. So it's defined as a freedom from rather than a freedom to. So freedom from government interference rather than freedom to whatever. So classical liberals support a minimal state, which does accompany negative freedoms. So that's the difference between positive freedoms and negative freedoms. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about John Stuart Mill. So John Stuart Mill started off a classical liberal, but he basically converts to modern liberalism. And there was an interesting argument which he made firstly about negative freedoms when he was a classical liberal, and then about positive freedoms when he was a modern liberal. So first up, we'll just briefly discuss the negative freedom argument from his classical liberal days. So there's this atrophy argument that he makes. So this basically says that if the state interferes and if the state restricts an individual in any way, it will limit our development as an individual, in the same way that an overprotective parent can basically stunt a child's growth. That's his first argument. Secondly, in the negative freedom argument, we have the overload argument. So the overload argument says that adding further responsibilities to the state will overload it. The state is already overloaded. If it takes on too many responsibilities, it will become more ineffective. The third argument is the initiative argument. So basically, this is the argument that there's an economic argument which can be made with this initiative argument, which is that a state which does too much will restrict, it will sap initiative, it will basically prevent those who would otherwise innovate in the economy from being able to do so. And then finally, on the negative freedom side, there is the corruption argument. So the idea that an extension of the state's powers adds to the likeliness of any abuse of power taking place. So we can go back to Lord Acton's famous statement that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So there's more chance of corruption in a bigger state. So, as I say, Mill converted from classical liberalism to modern liberalism, and therefore he abandoned that belief in negative freedoms and picked up a belief in positive freedoms. So there is an atrophy counter-argument which Mill puts forward. So basically he turns around and he argues, and he starts to argue that the state must supply public goods. So sometimes private provision cannot provide things like clean air, clean water. Therefore, it's the state's responsibility to provide those essentials to people. He argues that the state must interfere in some ways. It cannot adapt this laissez-faire approach to absolutely everything. So in order to protect vulnerable children, for example, the state should intervene and the state should act. the state needs to provide an education essential for an equality of opportunity. Therefore, that's another area where the state needs to act. It must be there to support basic welfare. And he basically says that where you have negative freedoms, the state cannot do all of these things. And it's the state's responsibility to do these things if it's going to create an equality of opportunity. So he does provide an atrophy counter-argument. The overload argument he also undoes. So he says that these extra responsibilities that the state may undertake are actually essential to provide and to maintain basic freedoms. So if liberalism is to live up to these core values, these core principles, they cannot do that unless they act, unless they embrace these positive freedoms. The initiative counter-argument. So he says things like there must be regulations of working hours. Individual consumers must be protected from unfair marketing and unscrupulous marketing campaigns. And then finally, there is the corruption counter-argument. So basically, you can go back to the positive view that liberals have of human nature. Some people may be corrupted, but the majority will not be. And if you have an effective system of checks and balances, you can root out any corruption as well. So those are the differences between positive and negative freedoms. And there's a little bit about Mill and how he goes from believing in negative freedoms to positive freedoms.